Imagine a sprawling high-tech fab humming in the Taiwanese night, producing chips so advanced that even a trillion-dollar tech empire must queue up for its services. Imagine being Samsung, a household name in electronics, and yet having to watch 90% of the world's most cutting-edge chip orders flow to a rival across the strait. It sounds unbelievable. How did we get here? And why can't Samsung seem to catch up? Why can't Samsung beat TSMC? This is the question at the heart of today's story. To understand this rivalry, we need to go back to the beginning, to how two very different companies came to dominate the semiconductor landscape. On one side, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, was founded in 1987 by Dr. Morris Chang with a radical idea: pure play foundry. Instead of designing its own chips, TSMC would only manufacture chips for other companies. At the time, this was unheard of. Most chip makers were IDMs, integrated device manufacturers, that did everything in-house: design, manufacture, sell. But Chang saw an opportunity. Countless fabless design firms were emerging, think Qualcomm, Broadcom, Nvidia, and they needed a trustworthy manufacturing partner. TSMC's founding mission was to be that trusted partner, essentially becoming the arms dealer for the industry. If you design a chip, TSMC will build it, and it won't compete with you. That neutrality was its ideology from day one. Meanwhile, Samsung Electronics took a very different path. Part of a mighty Korean chaebol, family-run conglomerate, Samsung built a vast electronics empire making everything from TVs to ships. In semiconductors, Samsung's rise began with memory chips, DRAM and NAND flash, during the 1980s and 1990s. With heavy government support and a relentless work culture, Samsung became the world's largest memory chip maker. Unlike TSMC, Samsung was an IDM. It both designed and manufactured chips, primarily to power its own products, like Samsung's TVs, appliances, and later its Galaxy smartphones. Any excess capacity it had could be offered to external customers, but contract manufacturing was not Samsung's main focus in its early chip years. These distinct origin stories set the stage. TSMC, the pure-play foundry with a laser focus on making other people's chips, versus Samsung, the integrated device maker aiming to strengthen its consumer electronics business. One was a specialist, the other a diversified giant. And in technology, focus can be a superpower. But it wasn't obvious in the early years that TSMC's model would triumph. After all, giants like Intel, IBM, and Samsung led cutting-edge chip-making for decades as IDMs. So how did TSMC's focused foundry model eventually overtake a behemoth like Samsung? To answer that, let's delve into the core philosophies each company lives by and how these ideologies shaped their performance. TSMC's entire identity revolves around being the best manufacturing partner. This pure-play foundry philosophy means a few crucial things. No in-house chips. TSMC doesn't sell its own branded chips or devices. It has zero products of its own that compete with its customers. This neutrality bred immense trust in an industry paranoid about IP theft and competitive leaks. When a company like Apple or Nvidia shares its crown jewel chip designs with TSMC, they know TSMC won't turn around and launch a rival product. This trust is not easily won. It's like a bank vault reputation that took decades for TSMC to build. Customer-centric culture. Because it exists only to serve clients, TSMC's culture became intensely customer-centric. Tim Cook, Apple's CEO, reportedly pointed out that some competitors just do not know how to be a foundry, implying they lack the customer-first mindset. TSMC, by contrast, has honed that skill as its core competency. If a client needs a custom process tweak or extra capacity, TSMC bends over backwards to deliver. As TSMC's founder Morris Chang put it, TSMC gets all the customers, charges the premium, and gets those profit margins, a direct result of winning customer trust. Singular focus on manufacturing excellence. Freed from designing its own chips, TSMC plows all its energy and massive capital into manufacturing technology. The company can afford to invest heavily in the latest equipment and process R&D without worrying about diverting funds to product design or marketing. It's no coincidence that TSMC's CapEx, capital expenditure, has reached stratospheric levels. In 2022, it spent a record $36.3 billion on new fabs and equipment. And even in the downcycle year, 2023, it spent about $30 billion solely to advance its manufacturing capabilities. Year after year, TSMC has outspent most peers on fab investments, ensuring it has the earliest access to cutting-edge tools like EUV, extreme ultraviolet lithography, and enough capacity for the biggest customers. Process technology leadership. That focus has paid off in technology. TSMC moved swiftly through each node. It went from 28 nanometers to 16 nanometers, FinFET, then 10 nanometers, 7 nanometers, 5 nanometers, and now 3 nanometers in quick succession, each time largely on schedule. By 2019, TSMC was pioneering high-volume use of EUV lithography at 7 nanometers and beyond, printing impossibly fine chip features with 13.5 nanometers ultraviolet light. TSMC often isn't the very first to experiment with new transistor structures, but when it does roll them out, it emphasizes yield and reliability. For example, TSMC stuck with the well-understood FinFET transistor design for its 3 nanometer node, postponing the jump to a new architecture until 2 nanometers. This cautious improvement approach meant that TSMC's 3 nanometer yields, the percentage of working chips per wafer, ramped up relatively smoothly, reportedly reaching around 60 to 70% in early production and aiming for approximately 80% as the process matures. TSMC's president, C.C. Wei, even boasted that TSMC's chips have better yield rates and thus lower cost per good chip than any rival. Ecosystem and advanced packaging. Over the years, TSMC also built a comprehensive ecosystem around its foundry services. It launched the Open Innovation Platform to help customers with design tools and IP, and dove into advanced packaging techniques. Back in 2016, TSMC introduced InFO integrated fan-out packaging, a form of FOWLP fan-out wafer-level packaging, to let Apple pack more components in a thinner package for the iPhone's A10 chip. It was a breakthrough that combined chips in new ways for better performance and size. Today, TSMC's advanced packages like CoWoS, chip on wafer on substrate, are crucial for high-performance chips, for example, stitching AI accelerators to memory. All this makes TSMC not just a maker of silicon wafers, but a one-stop shop to help customers squeeze maximum performance out of their designs. In short, TSMC's ideology has been foundry first, foundry only. It created an environment where every chip company, big or small, can see TSMC as an extension of their own team, not a competitor. This pure-play model provides scalability. If one customer's chip underperforms in the market, another customer's chip will likely take its place. Either way, TSMC wins because it's making them all. It's like being the tournament organizer rather than a single contestant. TSMC profits from the success of whoever comes out on top among its customers. This model has given TSMC unmatched scale and momentum, advantages that keep compounding, as we'll see. Now consider Samsung's ideology, shaped by its history as a Korean chaebol. Samsung Electronics is not just a chip company, it's a colossus spanning smartphones, TVs, home appliances, displays, and more. Within Samsung's semiconductor division, it historically excelled in memory chips, which are a very different game. High-volume standardized chips like DRAM and flash storage. Samsung's foray into the logic foundry business, making CPUs, GPUs, SoCs for others, came later, and has always been just one part of its vast enterprise. This has profound implications. Conflict of interest worries. Unlike TSMC, Samsung designs and sells its own chips and devices. For instance, Samsung develops its Exynos system on chips for Galaxy phones. It sells its own branded smartphones, and it competes in consumer electronics. This dual role immediately raises a red flag for potential foundry customers. If you're Apple, would you hand over the designs of your world-beating iPhone chip to Samsung, knowing Samsung makes Galaxy phones that compete directly with you? Customer trust becomes a huge hurdle. Indeed, industry experts have long pointed out that any IDM doing foundry work has to overcome clients' fear that their designs could be leaked to the IDM's product teams. Samsung tried to mitigate this by organizational separation. In 2017, it split off Samsung Foundry as a business unit separate from its consumer product chip design team. But the separation is internal, not a full legal spin-off. Many fabless customers remain skeptical. As a former Samsung engineer bluntly put it, it is better off for Samsung to split its foundry business to gain trust from customers. Only then could it truly focus. Samsung's leadership, however, has resisted a complete spin-off, likely because the foundry arm benefits from Samsung Group's deep pockets and internal chip demand. It's a catch-22. Keeping foundry in-house scares away some customers, but spinning it out risks cutting it off from the Samsung financial umbrella. Synergy, or distraction. Samsung often touts the synergy of its integrated model. For example, being able to use its own cutting-edge chips in Galaxy phones can showcase its tech and fill its fabs. In practice, though, this synergy is a double-edged sword. Internal priorities can conflict with external ones. If a capacity crunch hits, whose chips will Samsung prioritize? Its own Exynos and Galaxy components, or an outside customer's order? Even the perception of favoritism can drive customers away. Moreover, Samsung's management attention is split among many businesses. Contrast that with TSMC's single-minded focus. Samsung's CEO has to worry about smartphone market share, TV sales, and memory price cycles in addition to foundry technology. As a chaebol, Samsung's structure is hierarchical and top-down. Big strategic moves often require approval from the founding Lee family leadership. This can sometimes slow decision-making or lead to conservative choices aimed at bolstering Samsung's overall empire, not just the foundry unit's success. Pursuit of end-to-end dominance. Samsung's ideology is also about being a complete semiconductor house, from memory to logic, from foundry services to consumer products. In memory, this worked brilliantly. Samsung leads with approximately 40% global market share in DRAM. But in logic foundry, the focus needed to lead in process tech is unforgiving. By trying to do it all, Samsung arguably couldn't match the singular intensity of TSMC on leading-edge logic processes. Think of it this way. TSMC runs a 100-meter sprint, while Samsung runs a decathlon. Samsung is incredibly strong overall, but TSMC can pour every ounce of energy into that single race and usually win. Investment and scale. That said, never count Samsung out on resources. Samsung Electronics generates huge cash from memory and smartphones, and it has Korea's backing in strategic industries. Samsung's leadership declared an ambitious plan in 2019. Invest 171 trillion won, about $151 billion, in its logic chip and foundry business by 2030. This Vision 2030 aimed to overtake TSMC as the #1 foundry by the end of this decade. The money is there. Samsung has been pumping billions into new fabs in Pyeongtaek, Korea, and a massive new campus in Taylor, Texas. In fact, by some measures, Samsung's semiconductor capex, including memory, has matched or even exceeded TSMC's in recent years. For example, Samsung's total chip-related capex in 2022 was around 47.7 trillion won, $37.5 billion, on par with TSMC's $36 billion. The difference is allocation and return. Much of Samsung's spend goes to memory or its own products, whereas 100% of TSMC's spend goes into advancing foundry process technology for clients. Technology approach. Technically, Samsung's process engineering team is world-class. They were the first to commercialize FinFET transistors at 14 nanometers back in 2015, licensing some tech to global foundries slightly ahead of TSMC's 16 nanometers. They were aggressive in adopting EUV lithography too, claiming the world's first EUV-based 7-nanometer production in 2019. And famously, Samsung took a big leap with GAA, Gate-All-Around, transistor architecture at 3 nanometers in 2022, aiming to beat TSMC to the next-gen transistor design. This risk-taking reflects Samsung's desire to leapfrog and gain a marketing edge. World-first 3-nanometer GAA. However, in execution, these bold moves have sometimes backfired, as we'll soon discuss. Cutting-edge chip-making is unforgiving. An early lead means little if you can't achieve yield and reliability. In summary, Samsung's ideology is that of an integrated powerhouse. It wants to master everything from design to manufacturing, memory to logic, components to end products. It's an admirable vision, and indeed Samsung is formidable. Morris Chang himself called Samsung a 700-pound gorilla competitor. But this very breadth may be Samsung's Achilles heel in the foundry fight against a more focused rival. Next, let's explore how these strategic choices by TSMC and Samsung played out over time, through key moments that defined the gap between them. Every strategy comes with trade-offs. The pure play versus IDM difference between TSMC and Samsung manifests in several crucial trade-offs. 1. Trust versus control. TSMC sacrificed having its own products in order to earn customer trust. Samsung kept control of its own product destiny by making its own chips and devices, but at the expense of outsiders' trust. This means TSMC can work with virtually anyone: Apple, AMD, Nvidia, Qualcomm, even Samsung itself theoretically, with little reservation. In contrast, Samsung is inherently restricted. Certain top-tier companies simply won't partner with a direct competitor. Apple is the prime example. After relying on Samsung for early iPhone chips, Apple moved all its chip production to TSMC by 2014, starting with the A8 chip, and has stayed exclusively with TSMC since. Apple's reasoning was multifold. Not only did TSMC meet their technical needs, but also Apple was in a ferocious smartphone war with Samsung at the time. Handing your secret chip designs to your arch-rival felt untenable. TSMC's neutral stance made it a much safer bet. Second, focus versus diversification. TSMC's focus allows it to pour ungodly resources into one area, leading-edge manufacturing, and achieve economies of scale and depth of expertise that Samsung struggles to match in that singular area. For instance, consider process node development. When TSMC develops a new node, say 5 nanometers, it gets immediately utilized by dozens of customers. Smartphone chips, GPUs, CPUs, AI accelerators from many firms all go into TSMC's 5 nanometer fabs. This high mix and volume let TSMC learn fast, optimize yields, and recoup costs. Samsung, on the other hand, often initially fills a new node with 1 or 2 internal designs, maybe a new Exynos SoC or a Samsung-designed mobile processor. External orders might be few if customers are wary. With lower volume and design diversity on a node, Samsung's yield learning curve is steeper and slower. It's a vicious cycle. Low yield scares off more customers, which keeps volume low, which in turn makes it harder to improve yield. TSMC enjoys the opposite: a virtuous cycle of more customers, more wafers, faster yield improvement, even more customer confidence. In semiconductor manufacturing, yield is king. A higher yield directly reduces cost per chip and attracts more orders. By 2023 to 24, this dynamic became stark. TSMC's yields on advanced nodes significantly outpaced Samsung's, cementing TSMC's cost advantage. 3. Conservative roadmap versus bold jumps. Strategically, TSMC tends to be incremental, some would say conservative, in technology transitions, whereas Samsung has made some bold, even risky jumps. For example, at the 3-nanometer generation, Samsung introduced gate-all-around (GAA) transistors, a major change from FinFET, hoping to gain a performance efficiency edge, while TSMC stuck with a refined FinFET for its first-gen 3-nanometer and deferred GAA to 2-nanometer. The trade-off. Samsung could brag about being first to GAA, potentially attracting customers who want the latest tech. But GAA is a complex new technology. Samsung essentially bet on a bigger technical risk. TSMC bet on maturity and yield with FinFET. As it turned out, Samsung's GAA 3-nanometer hit rough waters. The yields were far below expectations. Samsung reportedly targeted approximately 70% yield on its initial 3-nanometer, but only achieved about 50 to 60% on the first-gen 3GAE 3-nanometer early process. Worse, its second-gen 3-nanometers, an improved version, was rumored to be around 20% yield, basically an abysmal one in 5 chips coming out functional. These are putrid yields, to quote one industry watcher. TSMC's more cautious approach meant its 3-nanometer, though, using older FinFET transistors, had more time to mature. By the time Apple's A17 and other 3-nanometer chips hit production, TSMC's yields were generally in the healthy range, 60%, and climbing, according to analysts. The result? Customers overwhelmingly stuck with TSMC for 3 nanometers, despite Samsung's head start on fancy transistors. Leading-edge chip-making is often a hare versus tortoise game. A frenzied leap can fail if not executed to perfection, and slow but steady can ultimately win the race. Fourth, breadth of portfolio versus sharpened skill set. Samsung's diversified chip portfolio means its R&D has to cover a lot. DRAM scaling techniques, 3D NAND flash, image sensors, OLED displays, mid-range and legacy logic nodes for its consumer products, and then the leading-edge logic for foundry clients. TSMC puts all R&D muscle into just logic process and packaging technologies. This has allowed TSMC's process engineers to develop unique expertise and proprietary approaches. For instance, TSMC pioneered certain multi-patterning techniques at 7 nanometers and 5 nanometers that squeezed more density out of lithography and optimized EUV insertion layer by layer for high volume. Samsung, splitting R&D efforts, had some instances where its process technology lagged in efficiency or design-friendly features. Some chip designers commented that Samsung's 5-nanometer design rules were more restrictive, making it harder to achieve chip performance targets compared to TSMC's 5-nanometer. While Samsung was busy beating rivals in memory, where it still rules, TSMC methodically captured the minds and hearts of logic chip designers. In essence, TSMC traded away diversification for singular excellence, and Samsung traded away singularity for a diversified strength. These trade-offs largely worked in TSMC's favor in the foundry arena. But the story also hinged on a series of turning points, moments where each company's decisions and performance had game-changing consequences. Let's look at those pivotal moments next. The Samsung versus TSMC rivalry for foundry leadership wasn't decided overnight. It was a series of battles and inflection points over the past 15+ years. Here are the key turning points that explain why Samsung can't seem to overtake TSMC. The Apple defection, 2013 to 2014. Perhaps the most fateful turning point was Apple's decision to move its chip manufacturing to TSMC. In the early iPhone era, Apple dual-sourced chips from Samsung, which made sense. Samsung had 45-nanometer and 32-nanometer capability needed for Apple's A4, A5, A6 chips. But around 2013, Apple was frustrated with Samsung. They were fierce competitors in smartphones and locked in patent lawsuits. Moreover, Apple needed cutting-edge 20 nanometers for the upcoming A8 chip, and wanted advanced packaging to make the iPhone logic board sleeker. TSMC offered both. In 2014, the iPhone 6's A8 processor was built entirely by TSMC on 20 nanometers, ending Apple's reliance on Samsung. Apple shifting loyalty was a huge win for TSMC. Not only was Apple a high-volume customer, bringing billions in revenue, but Apple's public vote of confidence signaled to the whole industry that TSMC's tech had pulled ahead. Samsung lost a marquee client and never won them back. This was like a giant seal of approval on the pure-play model. Apple implicitly trusted TSMC's neutrality and execution more. From this point on, Apple poured resources into co-developing leading nodes with TSMC, reportedly even funding some of TSMC's capacity expansion in exchange for guaranteed supply. The Apple-TSMC partnership accelerated TSMC's advancement, creating a wide moat that Samsung struggled to bridge. 14nm FinFET, a temporary Samsung lead, 2015. Samsung did enjoy a victory around 2015 when it beat TSMC to the punch with FinFET transistors at the crunched 14nm generation. Samsung's 14nm process, and its licensed twin at global foundries, was ready in time for certain flagship chips. Notably, some of Apple's A9 chips, iPhone 6s, were dual-sourced on Samsung 14nm and TSMC 16nm, and Qualcomm chose Samsung's 14nm for its Snapdragon 820. It seemed Samsung was neck and neck or slightly ahead at this node. However, Samsung's triumph was short-lived. Apple quickly discovered TSMC's 16nm version of A9 was more power-efficient than Samsung's. Minor differences in process can have big impacts. And after the A9, Apple never split production again, going all in with TSMC. TSMC also caught up by ramping a full 10nm node by 2017, used in Apple A10/A11, whereas Samsung's 10nm had some yield issues and saw limited external adoption. The lesson: Samsung's brief process lead didn't convert into sustained business because TSMC's execution and customer support still edged them out. The 7nm ramp and Qualcomm's switch, 2018 to 2019. The next crucial phase was 7nm. TSMC went full throttle at 7nm in 2018, and this node became a blockbuster, used by Apple, A12, A13, Huawei's HiSilicon Kirin chips, AMD's Zen 2 CPUs and Navi GPUs, etc. Samsung also developed a 7nm, but notably missed out on major mobile chip wins initially. Qualcomm's flagship, Snapdragon 845, 2018, was built on Samsung 10nm, but by 2019's Snapdragon 855, Qualcomm opted for TSMC's 7nm. Samsung's 7nm process, which introduced extreme ultraviolet on some layers, 7LPP, wasn't ready in time or wasn't chosen by these big players. Additionally, in 2018, GlobalFoundries GF, another competitor, dropped out of the 7nm race, citing the immense cost. This left only TSMC and Samsung as the two real options for cutting-edge logic. TSMC's ability to deliver a reliable 7nm with high yield made it almost a monopolist for leading designs. Samsung realized the danger and doubled down on foundry investment. The 2019 $116 billion plan was announced in this context. But losing Qualcomm's premium chip business to TSMC was painful because Qualcomm had been Samsung's big external customer through the 14nm/10nm era. It signaled that even a traditionally Samsung-aligned client would jump ship if TSMC's process was better. 2020 to 2021, Nvidia and the 5nm/5LPE node. Mixed results. In 2020, another twist. Nvidia went with Samsung for its RTX 3000 series GPU chips. Those massive GPUs were made on Samsung's 8nm process. which was actually a modified 10 nanometer. Why Samsung? Partly because by then TSMC's 7 nanometer capacity was largely booked by others, Apple, AMD, etc. So Nvidia took a chance on Samsung to secure supply. The chips worked, but Samsung's process efficiency was a bit behind. The RTX 3000 cards ran hot and power-hungry, though Nvidia managed it with engineering. Meanwhile, TSMC forged ahead with 5 nanometers, N5, in 2020, landing Apple's A14 and M1 chip business and others like Qualcomm's mid-cycle Snapdragon 888 Plus, which switched to TSMC 5 nanometers. Samsung had its analogous 5 nanometer 5LPE node in 2020, and actually did win Qualcomm's Snapdragon 888 on it. However, reports soon emerged that Samsung's 5 nanometer yields and power efficiency were inferior. Devices with Samsung fabbed Snapdragons showed heat and battery drain issues compared to devices with TSMC fabbed chips, in cases where both existed. Qualcomm, learning from this, pivoted again. The 2022 Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 was initially on Samsung 4 nanometers, but mid-year Qualcomm introduced the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 on TSMC N4, an optimized 5 nanometer family node, and saw immediate improvements. Essentially, Qualcomm re-fooled me once, not twice. Samsung's 4 nanometer yields were reportedly a dismal approximately 35% for the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, driving Qualcomm to quickly rebalance production to TSMC, whose comparable 4 nanometer had much healthier approximately 70 to 80% yield and better power characteristics. This was a huge reputational hit for Samsung Foundry. It's one thing to have slightly lower performance. It's another for a customer to pull production mid-cycle due to yield problems. By the end of 2022, Samsung effectively lost Qualcomm's flagship chip business entirely to TSMC. 3 nanometers and the GAA gamble, 2022 to 2023. This brings us to the most recent turning point. Samsung made headlines in June 2022, announcing it was first to 3 nanometer production with GAA transistors. But fanfare aside, the reality was that Samsung's 3 nanometers in 2022 was a limited risk production, mainly for a low-power cryptocurrency mining chip. No major consumer product used Samsung's 3 nanometers that year. Meanwhile, TSMC's 3 nanometer, using tried-and-true FinFETs, ramped in late 2022 and hit volume in 2023, immediately being adopted by Apple's A17 Pro in the iPhone and other big designs. As discussed under trade-offs, Samsung's GAA 3 nanometer suffered yield woes, which became public knowledge in 2023 to 2024. The numbers are stark. Samsung's first gen 3 nanometer had around 50% yield, second gen around 20%, far below an economically viable level. TSMC's 3 nanometers, by contrast, was reported by analysts to be in the 60 to 70% range initially and improving. This led to a mass exodus of potential Samsung 3 nanometer customers. For instance, Google had been using Samsung for its Tensor phone chips on 5 nanometers/4 nanometers, but for the next-gen Tensor G3/G4, Google decided to move to TSMC 3 nanometers. Tesla, which had Samsung build its earlier FSD, full self-driving computer chips at 14 nanometers, was rumored to consider Samsung 7 nanometers, but ultimately Tesla chose TSMC's 4 nanometers for its Hardware 4 computer in 2022. And of course, Qualcomm and Apple weren't even considering Samsung at 3 nanometers. They locked in with TSMC long before. By 2023, effectively no top-tier high-performance chip was built on Samsung's 3 nanometer, a devastating reality after Samsung's boast of being first. TSMC's conservative but well-executed 3 nanometer had captured the entire leading-edge market. Each of these turning points widened TSMC's lead and made it harder for Samsung to catch up. Winning Apple permanently shifted the balance. The yield failures at 4 nanometers per 3 nanometers tarnished Samsung's credibility just as the stakes rose into the billions. A telling statistic: by fourth quarter 2024, TSMC commanded about 67% of global foundry market share, with Samsung at roughly 8%. Not only has Samsung not closed the gap has actually widened in recent years. TSMC's share was about 4 times that of Samsung's in 2021, and it's now 5 to 6 times higher. This dominance means TSMC can outinvest, outhire, and outlearn Samsung year after year. It's a self-reinforcing lead. So where do things stand now in the mid-2020s? The current outlook finds TSMC and Samsung in very different positions, almost mirror images of confidence. TSMC today is often described as having a near monopoly at the leading edge. It's the default choice for anyone needing the most advanced chips. The company's revenue reflects that. TSMC has for several years held 50 to 60% of the overall foundry market by revenue, and an even higher percentage, 90% plus, of the bleeding-edge node capacity. Its customer list is a who's who of tech: Apple, AMD, Nvidia, Qualcomm, MediaTek, Broadcom, and even Intel, which plans to have TSMC make some GPU tiles for its CPU. TSMC's process roadmap remains full steam ahead: 3 nanometers in mass production, 2 nanometers, with GAA transistors, planned for 2025 mass production, and research already ongoing for next-gen packaging and materials for beyond 2 nanometers. The company is financially robust, consistently generating hefty profits, gross margins in the approximately 50% range. In 2022, while Samsung's foundry posted losses, TSMC earned billions in profit. It had an annual net income of over $30 billion on $75 billion revenue, reflecting its high pricing power. TSMC is using that cash to expand geographically as well, building new fabs in Arizona and Japan, urged by governments for supply chain resilience. There are challenges: cost overruns and delays in those overseas fabs, and softer demand in cyclical downturns. But these don't fundamentally threaten TSMC's technology leadership at the moment. In fact, demand from AI chips, like Nvidia's GPUs for data centers, has created a new engine of growth for TSMC, as only TSMC can build the advanced AI accelerators with required performance. This AI boom has TSMC's fab lines running hot and its market share climbing even further in high-end segments. Samsung's foundry today finds itself at a crossroads. Despite pouring money and having top-notch talent, it has not cracked the dominance of TSMC. Samsung remains the distant number 2 foundry, and even that position is a bit precarious for the first time. In 2023-24, Taiwanese foundry UMC and China's SMIC at older nodes have grown to each hold approximately 5 to 6% share, nibbling at Samsung's heels. Samsung's share fell to single digits in late 2022 and 2023 during the downturn, hitting approximately 8 to 13% depending on the quarter. Part of this drop was the cyclical semiconductor slump, but part was losing major orders, like Qualcomm, etc., as discussed. The company has massive new fabs under construction, a huge new site in Taylor, Texas, investing approximately $17 billion initially, aimed to start production by 2025 to 2026, and expansions in Korea. However, those fabs will only succeed if there are customers to fill them. And herein lies Samsung's hurdle: winning customers' confidence back. There are some positive signs. Samsung has reportedly improved its 4-nanometer yields to approximately 70% by mid-2023, closing the gap on that node. It also claims progress on 3-nanometer yield improvement, though still behind. Additionally, Samsung is leveraging its advanced packaging solutions, like the iCube chiplet interposer tech and Xcube 3D stacking, to offer more value, similar to TSMC's packaging offerings. They've even announced collaborations to bolster their ecosystem, e.g., forming the Samsung Advanced Foundry ecosystem, SAFE, to work with EDA tool and IP companies, mirroring TSMC's open innovation platform. Internally, Samsung is re-evaluating its approach to customers. There's an acknowledgement, even in Korean media, that Samsung's foundry business historically had a dismissive attitude toward smaller clients. Perhaps a legacy of being such a giant, Samsung wasn't as nimble in catering to each customer's needs as TSMC. Now, under Lee Jae-yong's, J.Y. Lee's leadership, Samsung appears to be changing tune, courting customers more openly, and even considering adjusting its corporate structure. Industry observers speculated that Samsung might spin off or further separate the foundry division to reassure customers of confidentiality. In late 2024, Samsung's chief publicly stated they are not spinning it off yet, but the fact the question is being asked shows the pressure Samsung is under to adapt its ideology for the foundry game. Technologically, Samsung's current outlook banks on making a comeback at 2 nanometers and beyond. They've doubled down on GAA transistors and believe the experience from 3 nanometer GAA will pay dividends at 2 nanometers, where TSMC will also move to GAA. Samsung has also talked about new materials, transistor scaling techniques, and increasing use of EUV layers to catch up. It's also positioning as a potential alternative as geopolitics plays out. Some companies might consider diversifying away from TSMC's heavy Taiwan concentration for risk management. Samsung's fabs in Korea, and soon the US, could benefit from that hedge mindset. Still, the current sentiment in the industry is that TSMC is at least a full generation ahead in practical terms, and Samsung is in a mode of damage control and patient rebuilding. A quote making rounds was that Samsung is a formidable but not admirable competitor. Formidable in might, but not yet admired in the foundry space for its execution. As of now, TSMC continues to set the pace, and Samsung is playing catch-up on multiple fronts: technology, yield, customer trust, and ecosystem.